Hey, Mark. From time to
Eric.
time, you have content that doesn't make it into your Sunday message, and you like to share it. So, you got something for us today?
Yeah, interestingly, I do. You may have noticed this Sunday I was talking about how the Bible is authoritative and reliable and inspired or expired by God. But one of the words that I strategically avoided was the word inerrant. And the reason is it takes some time to unpack the idea of the question of, is the Bible inerrant? For example, if I take this New International Version of the Bible that I've been studying this morning and have sitting out on my desk every week, is this Bible inerrant? And some of the people who are watching might be shocked to hear a pastor say, no, I actually don't think that this copy of the Bible is inerrant. You got to go through some subtleties related to this because, to be honest, I don't really like the word inerrant because of what it implies and where it takes people. Now, the Christian Missionary Alliance, which is the denomination that we're a part of, actually subscribes to the idea that the Bible is inerrant in its original form. In fact, if you take a look at our doctrinal statement, that's exactly what it says, that it's inerrant in its original writing. And that's something that I do personally subscribe to as a part of the Christian Missionary Alliance. But the problem is what we talked about on Sunday, how when you have a certain copy of the Bible or a book of the Bible, it actually fades into the dust of history because it's written on papyrus, and that eventually fades, and what we have is copies or copies of copies or copies of copies of copies. So while I completely affirm that the Bible is inerrant in its original writing, we also have to confess that we don't have the original writing to be able to take a look at and say, what is the exact inerrant version in its original language? As we mentioned on Sunday, when you have copies and copies of copies and copies of copies of copies that you're using to get back to the idea what was the original one that was written, you are bound to have some transcription errors or variants in your manuscript variants. Because somewhere along the line, there's going to be some scribe, even though they were super careful, and they were super careful, every once in a while they have a scribe who makes a mistake, who leaves out the equivalent of an apostrophe or misspells a word or does something that's different. And so you go, well, does that count as an error? What if they accidentally add a zero or take a zero off of a number at the end of a sequence? What if they misspell something? And now is there an error in the Bible? And in my mind, that's something that we have to take carefully into consideration. The next thing we have to take into consideration is that when you translate anything from one language to another, you always lose some meaning. Now, the good news is the Bible is translated directly from Hebrew to English in the Old Testament or Greek to English in the New Testament, and a little bit of Aramaic smattered in there as well. So the translations that we have are highly reliable translations. But even if you have a highly reliable translation, you miss some subtleties and some nuances, and it makes you ask the question, well then is it still inerrant in English, even if it was inerrant in the original Greek or the original Hebrew? Now, nearly all scholars and nearly all Christian Missionary Alliance people that I know will acknowledge that somewhere along the way there were some manuscript variants, and somewhere along the way there's some nuances that we miss in terms of our Bible that we have, and that's why the Christian Missionary Alliance documents are very clear to say that the Bible is inerrant in its original writing, and why I'm careful never to say that this Bible in English is inerrant. Now, with that being said, we have to ask the more important question, well then, can I trust it? Does it have to be absolutely perfect to be trustworthy? And while I would acknowledge there are minor manuscript variants that are out there, and there are translation subtleties that are sometimes challenging for us to be able to interpret, the big picture is that the Bible is authoritative, it's reliable, it is God's Word, it's inspired by God, and we can trust it to be a guide and a level for our life, even when we're being careful with our language related to inerrancy. So then how many variants would you be able to find within a text from the copies of copies? That's an important question that scholars ask all the time. Now, when the Bible was transcribed from one Hebrew copy to another, one of the interesting things to note is how careful the transcribers were in the transcribing that they did. So when they would go from the original to the copy that they're making, they wouldn't do one word at a time on the manuscript. They would do one letter at a time. They washed their hands carefully before they would ever engage with it. They washed their hands when they were done because they thought this was a holy activity. And then after they did one page, letter for letter, they would go back and count the number of letters to make sure it was exact. And they would have another person come in and count the number of letters to make sure that it was exact. And then they would count the number of half of the letters and get to what the middle letter is, note what that letter is, and then go to their new copy and do the exact same thing to make sure the middle letter was exactly the same. You see, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have one letter difference on an entire page, and if they didn't get it exactly right, they would scrap the page and start again. It was arduous work. And it was work that was done at a place called Qumran. Now that's where the Essene community was. They were a bit of an ascetic, kind of Amish-like community that was removed from the rest of Israel, and they were in Qumran. You may not know where that is, but I just happen to have a map to be able to show you this. Here's your map of Israel. This is where Jerusalem is right here, and the Qumran community is right there next to the Dead Sea. Now, they were active around zero-ish. Their community ended in the 60s AD. And what they did is they had huge numbers of scrolls that they would put into clay pots and then leave in caves. Now, those clay pot scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, and you may recognize them as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you might wonder, what was such a big deal about the Dead Sea Scrolls? What did they help us with? Well, they helped us with this question of manuscript variants. How many manuscript variants are there out there? Because a book, say, like the book of Isaiah, was written in the 6th century BC, and the earliest copy that we had of one, and this copies of copies, came from about 700 AD, which is a span of 1,300 years. And so scholars said, wow, Isaiah, there could have been a lot of shenanigans, a lot of copy errors, a lot of problems between the original and the earliest one that we have. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they were dated to around the year 0, or maybe even 100 BC. What does that mean? That means we had 700 years of variants that we could take a look at and see how much did that text change over those 700 years. And while there were manuscript variants found in the book of Isaiah, quite a few, the variants that were found there were the equivalent of a tiny spelling error or a comma or an apostrophe in the English language. They were minor variants that were there that never changed the meaning of the text. That even though there were some challenges there, the Dead Sea Scrolls told us that the scrolls that we had, that we were dealing with from the book of Isaiah and all kinds of other Old Testament literature were the same as the ones that you could find 700 years earlier. It's just a testimony to the care that people took in translating those manuscripts and the minimal number of variants that would be out there.